Curious Lloyd.
Throughout the span of history, there have been criminals and madmen lurking in the shadows, wreaking death and destruction, and that would be fine in a just universe, or at least a universe full of dashing vigilantes who dress up like vermin that infest your garage. But we don't live in that universe. We live in a regular universe where some of the greatest monsters have completely gotten away with it. Joseph Kony, the child-snatching warlord and viral star. Joseph Kony is the guy who starred in that video you shared on Facebook all those years ago, an act which, and wouldn't you just know it, didn't in any way hold him accountable for the several lifetimes worth of murder, rape, and anguish he is responsible for. Kony is the warlord in charge of the Lord's Resistance Army, a pseudo-Christian guerrilla army operating in Central Africa, responsible for the atrocities, including civilian massacres, rapes, bombings, and assassinations. But their main claim to fame is children. They attack villages, scoop up the orphans they just created, and recruit them as child soldiers, or servants, or sex slaves. Between 1987 and 2006, they abducted 20,000 children from families all over Central Africa, which is about 20,000 more reasons than you'd need to stop him. And indeed, the international community has been trying to put an end to Kony for the last 30 years. The countries he's operating in all contribute to the Mutual Strike Force targeting the LRA, and President Obama deployed troops to that region to join the hunt. Kony's army also suffers from a high number of defections, as you might expect from an army composed of hostages. But his fighting force isn't what it was. But despite all that, no one's caught him yet. There's an excellent chance he's hiding out in South Sudan, a nation which has refused, point blank, to allow outside troops to enter their borders to look for him. It's rumoured that he's intentionally being sheltered by the Sudanese government, which means that the international community really needs to stay on this and refuse to let him slip away. But apparently, American media have claimed that they've given up entirely, so maybe the next social network will get him. Jamaal Al Badawi, the USS Cole mastermind. The year 2000 can sometimes seem like a long-lost utopia of space and time continuum, forever ensconced in that misty era before 9/11, which included terrorist attacks, tsunamis, and celebrity deaths. The 2000s was a decade when news moved fast, and thanks to social media, earth-shattering events unfolded in real time. But prior to 9/11, Al-Qaeda was notable for two attacks: the 1998 US Embassy bombings and the 2000 attack on the USS Cole. The man on the ground coordinating the USS Cole attack was Jamaal Al Badawi, a middle manager type who rented the safe houses, gathered equipment, and surveilled the port of information on everything from shipping traffic to average refueling time, and to crucially find out how small vessels were able to get to the warships. He might not have planned the bombs personally, but he handed the blueprint for the attack to the guys who did. We know all this because he was caught. He was actually sentenced to 15 years by the Yemeni government. But sadly, that sentence was reduced somewhat when a prison breakout freed him and dozens of Al-Qaeda operatives. And that's when he disappeared again. But actually, a short while after escaping, he handed himself in and apologised for any inconvenience that he might have caused by blowing up sailors. He even went as far to pledge loyalty to the Yemeni president. This shameless, shallow gesture totally worked because the Yemeni justice system doesn't have any laws against jihad or blowing up ships or any of the usual things laws are good for. William Morales, the extremist Puerto Rican independence bomber. As much as we worry about the threat posed by extremist groups today, we tend to forget the bad old days of the 1970s. The Weather Underground, Black September, the JDL, the Black Liberation Army. All of those groups were bombing the US at one point, but none of them could hold a candle to the FALN, an extremist group fighting for Puerto Rican independence. The FALN carried out over 120 terrorist attacks in their time, killing 5 and injuring dozens more. William Morales was one of the guys responsible for building their bombs. A radicalized student, he diligently built bombs until 1978, at which point his career was reduced a smidge by blowing himself up, which robbed him of his fingers and also got him arrested. But with the help of his attorney, he escaped from prison and rejoined the FALN as their MVP. Unfortunately for Morales, It turns out that while being one of the country's most wanted men might draw some eyeballs, but being one of the country's most wanted men and having no fingers draws even more. He was forced to flee to Mexico, where he kept a low profile long enough to kill a police officer and get sent to prison for 5 years. After his release, he then fled to Cuba and claimed political asylum, at which point the trail runs cold. There are rumours that he married and started a family, but it's hard to be sure. One thing we do know is that he requested amnesty in the United States in 1997. This wasn't granted, even though Bill Clinton went on to pardon a bunch of FALM members in 1999. It turns out, take-backsies don't apply when you blow up people for a living. But now that America has re-established diplomatic relations with Cuba, there's a chance that both in the prison system might get to reacquaint with him. Felicien Kabuga, the financer of the Rwandan genocide. There's generally a limit to how much damage one lunatic can do. Whether it's with axes or guns or bombs, they'll eventually reach a point, often police assisted, where they just can't murder anymore, unless they get others to do their killing for them. And that's where Felicien Kabuga comes in. Following the assassination of Rwanda's president in 1994, the Hutu Rwandans' dominant ethnic group, they embarked on a rampage across the country, with the aim of wiping out the country's minority ethnic group, the Tutsi, a multi-millionaire with strong ties to the Hutu government. Kabuga was the money man behind the massacre and took part in its planning from the outset. He financed the purchase of huge quantities of machetes and other sharp farming implements and facilitated their distribution to the hardliner Hutu thugs. He also bankrolled the operation of the radio television Libre des Mille Collins, a government-owned radio station that shied away from broadcasting drive-time classics in lieu of racist, dehumanizing propaganda that portrayed the Tutsi as cockroaches to be stamped out. It was also instrumental in triggering the genocide by broadcasting the coded phrase, "cut down the tall trees," to knowing gangs. He also operated a magazine. The genocide went on for 3 months until heavily armed Tutsi forces was able to retake the country. The Hutu fled into neighbouring countries out of the fear of a comeback, leaving a final death toll of 800,000 men, women and children. Among the newfound exiles was Kabuga. Following the collapse of the regime, he fled to Switzerland until they got wind of the war crime charges that were coming and kicked him out. Since then, his wealth has allowed him to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. He carries multiple passports, bribes border officials, and employs local police to tip him off when a raid is expected. The last time he came close to being caught was when a local informer tipped the authorities about a meeting that Kabuga was due to attend. Kabuga never showed up, and the informant was later found dead, which I'm sure was a complete coincidence. Heinrich Muller, head of the Gestapo. Heinrich Muller was head of the Gestapo and responsible for, well, I'm sure you can name the atrocity. He probably did it with a smile on his face and a song in his heart. He hunted down resistant organizations, organized the persecution and deportation of Jews across Europe, collected extensive records on the ever-growing death toll and converted them into executive reports for high command, and arranged murder upon murder upon murder upon murder. But if that's not enough for you, let's judge him by the company he keeps. Here's a picture of him on the right, rubbing shoulders with Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, the latter of whom is referred to as the architect of the Holocaust. And while Himmler committed suicide following his capture by the Allies, and Heydrich was killed by assassins, Muller spent the final days of war in the Führer bunker, pledging allegiance to the regime until the very end. The end being something the Soviets were more than willing to provide him. But in the chaos of the war's last days, he vanished and was never seen again. It's possible he was killed in the Battle of Berlin. In the years after the war, a few Germans said they thought they saw his body after the fighting, but no one was ever sure. In 2013, a researcher claimed that he'd been killed during combat and accidentally buried in, of all possible places, a Jewish cemetery. But no 100% conclusive proof was ever provided for this claim either. Still, this was not a guy you could just shrug his shoulders about. The Allies questioned everyone about his whereabouts. This was made a little more complicated by the fact that his name was the German equivalent of John Smith. Whilst working for the Nazis, for instance, Muller had to be referred as Gestapo Muller, But the Allied investigators persisted, chasing up on a bunch of bad leads, and still found nothing. His mistress also denied seeing him again. The Soviets said they didn't know where he was. Even the CIA had to refute allegations that they had captured him. This being an era where they were known to be shipping off Nazis to work at Cape Canaveral. With so little to go on, it was just about safe to assume he was dead when Adolf Eichmann, an escaped SS officer and a colleague of Muller's, was captured in Argentina in the 1960s. He confessed to his Israeli interrogators that he thought Muller was alive, and, although there wasn't much evidence to support it, it left a weird itch in the back of everyone's mind that has never gone quite away.